Donald Trump just gave Canada an ultimatum that could trigger the biggest trade war in North American history. $2.8 trillion. That's what Trump says Canada owes the United States, and he's not asking politely. Now look, this isn't just some political theater. The economic alliance that's kept North America stable for decades, it's hanging by a thread. And by the time most people realize what's happening, it'll be too late. Here's what the mainstream media isn't telling you. While everyone's distracted by the latest headline drama, Trump's team has been quietly building a case that Canada's trade policies have cost American workers nearly $3 trillion over the past few decades. Believe it or not, this isn't coming out of nowhere. The U.S. trade deficit with Canada has been widening for years. Energy exports, lumber, dairy. The list goes on. And Trump's advisors are claiming it's all been systematically rigged against American industries. You've probably seen the factory towns, the shuttered plants, the Made in America stickers that don't mean what they used to. Trump's betting his entire economic strategy on making Canada the villain in that story. But here's the thing most people don't understand. This ultimatum, it's been years in the making. And the cracks in the U.S.-Canada relationship started long before Trump sent this demand. Let's break down this $2.8 trillion figure. According to sources close to the Trump administration, it's based on accumulated trade deficits, subsidies to Canadian industries, and what they're calling unfair competitive advantages in sectors like lumber, dairy, and energy. The number sounds massive because it is, but it's also calculated over multiple decades of trade imbalances. Trump's team took every year where the U.S. imported more from Canada than it exported, added them all up, and slapped a price tag on it. Now, economists will tell you this isn't how trade actually works. Countries don't owe each other money just because one imports more than the other. That's like saying you owe your grocery store because you buy more from them than they buy from you. But Trump's not interested in economic theory. He's interested in leverage. And Canada? They're calling it economic fiction. Canadian officials have pointed out that the U.S. actually runs a surplus with Canada when you factor in services. Financial services, tech consulting, entertainment. When you add all that up, the picture looks completely different. Plus, they argue, American companies benefit massively from Canadian resources, especially oil and natural gas. Let's be real for a second. Without Canadian energy, large parts of the northern U.S. would face serious shortages, especially in winter. Canada supplies about 60% of U.S. crude oil imports. That's millions of barrels every single day flowing across the border. Refineries in the Midwest and Northeast are specifically built to process Canadian heavy crude. If that supply gets disrupted, gas prices don't just go up, they skyrocket. But here's where it gets messy. Trump doesn't care about nuance, he cares about leverage. And he's using this ultimatum to force Canada into renegotiating everything from CUSMA to defense spending to environmental regulations. The demand letter that went to Ottawa reportedly includes provisions that have nothing to do with trade. We're talking about NATO spending commitments, Arctic security partnerships, and even immigration enforcement at the northern border. It's not just an economic ultimatum, it's a complete restructuring of the relationship. And Canada's options? They're all bad. Okay, so what if Trump actually follows through? Let's game this out, because the consequences aren't just theoretical, they're very, very real. Scenario 1. Tariffs on Canadian goods. If the US slaps tariffs on Canadian lumber, dairy, and energy exports, prices in America will spike almost overnight. Lumber prices already went crazy during the pandemic, hitting record highs that made home construction nearly impossible for average Americans. This could be worse. Your grocery bill? Up. Dairy products rely heavily on Canadian imports in certain regions. Cheese, butter, yogurt, all of it gets more expensive. Home construction costs? Up. A 25% tariff on Canadian lumber could add $10,000 to $15,000 to the cost of building a new home. That's not speculation. That's what happened during previous trade disputes. Gas prices? Depends on how much Canadian oil gets choked off. But analysts are projecting an additional 50 cents to $1 per gallon if Canadian crude exports face serious restrictions. And it's not just consumers who suffer. American manufacturers rely on Canadian steel and aluminum. Auto plants in Michigan and Ohio use Canadian parts. Agricultural operations in the northern states depend on Canadian fertilizer. You start cutting those supply chains, and entire industries grind to a halt. Now, the Trump administration would argue that short-term pain is worth it for long-term gain, that these tariffs would force American industries to rebuild domestically, to bring jobs back. But here's the problem with that theory. You can't rebuild an industrial base overnight. It takes years, maybe decades. You need trained workers, infrastructure, investment capital, and even then, you're competing with countries that have decades of experience and economies of scale. So, what actually happens in the short term? Americans pay more, a lot more, and don't think Canada's just gonna sit there and take it. Scenario 2. Canada retaliates. Canada could retaliate with tariffs on American cars, machinery, and agricultural products. That means pain for Detroit, pain for Midwest farmers, pain for anyone whose job depends on cross-border trade. Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. These states could get hammered. The auto industry alone employs millions of Americans, and a significant chunk of that production is integrated with Canadian plants. Parts cross the border multiple times during the manufacturing process. You disrupt that flow, and assembly lines shut down. Farmers in the Midwest export billions of dollars in corn, soybeans, and wheat to Canada every year. If Canada slaps retaliatory tariffs on those goods, American farmers lose one of their biggest customers. And we've seen this playbook before. Remember when Trump imposed tariffs on Chinese goods? China retaliated by targeting American agricultural products. Soybean farmers in Iowa and Illinois got destroyed. The government had to bail them out with billions in subsidies. The same thing could happen with Canada. Except, this time it's worse, because unlike China, Canada is right next door. The economic integration is far deeper. There's another angle here that nobody's talking about. Canadian provinces could respond independently. Ontario might target Michigan industries. Quebec could go after Vermont and New Hampshire. British Columbia could hit Washington state. This isn't just a federal government versus federal government situation. It's a regional economic war that could spiral out of control very quickly. But that's not even the craziest part. Here's what keeps economists up at night. If the US-Canada alliance fractures, it doesn't just hurt us. It reshapes the entire global order. China's already circling. They've been trying to increase trade ties with Canada for years. If Canada feels abandoned by the US, they might pivot harder toward Beijing. Now look, Canada's not going to become a Chinese satellite state overnight. But every percentage point of trade that shifts away from the US is leverage we lose. And China knows this. Beijing has been investing heavily in Canadian infrastructure, natural resources, and technology companies. If the US-Canada relationship deteriorates, those investments accelerate. Imagine a scenario where Canadian oil starts flowing to China instead of the United States, where Canadian minerals critical for tech manufacturing go to Shenzhen instead of Silicon Valley. It sounds far-fetched, but the infrastructure is already being built. China's been expanding port facilities on Canada's west coast. They've been negotiating long-term energy contracts. They've been positioning themselves for exactly this moment. And then there's the Arctic. Climate change is opening up new shipping routes and resource deposits in the Arctic. Canada and the US have jointly defended that region for decades. But if this alliance collapses, Russia's already positioning itself to fill the vacuum. You think Putin's not watching this right now? Russia's been militarizing the Arctic for years. New bases, new icebreakers, new claims to underwater resources. The only thing stopping them from total dominance has been the US-Canada partnership. If that falls apart, the Arctic becomes a free-for-all. And it's not just about military positioning. The Arctic contains an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its undiscovered natural gas. Trillions of dollars in resources. Whoever controls the Arctic controls a massive piece of the 21st century economy. Right now, that's supposed to be us, the United States and Canada, working together. But if Trump's ultimatum breaks that partnership, we're handing Russia and China the keys to the kingdom. There's also a NATO dimension to this that's being completely ignored. Canada is a founding member of NATO. They fought alongside American troops in every major conflict since World War II. Afghanistan, Iraq, the Cold War. Canada's been there. But NATO membership comes with obligations. And one of those obligations is mutual defense. If the US starts treating Canada as an economic adversary, how does that affect military cooperation? How does that affect intelligence sharing? How does that affect our ability to respond to threats as a unified alliance? These are questions that don't have good answers. And while we're fighting with our closest ally, our actual adversaries are getting stronger. Now, here's where this gets even more complicated. There's a domestic political angle that most analysts are missing. Trump's ultimatum isn't just about Canada. It's about sending a message to every other trading partner that the old rules don't apply anymore. Mexico, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, they're all watching this very carefully. If Trump can bully Canada into accepting his demands, what's to stop him from doing the same thing to them? And if he can't, if Canada stands firm and calls his bluff, then Trump looks weak, and that's something he absolutely cannot afford going into an election cycle. So this ultimatum is actually a trap for both sides. Canada can't give in without looking like they surrendered their sovereignty, but they also can't afford a full-blown economic war with their largest trading partner. Trump can't back down without looking like he lost, but he also can't follow through without causing massive economic damage to American workers and industries. It's a game of chicken where both drivers are accelerating toward each other, and neither one wants to swerve first. And you know who suffers in that scenario? Regular people. The workers who lose their jobs when factories close. The families who can't afford groceries anymore. The small business owners who depend on cross-border trade to survive. They don't have lobbyists in Washington. They don't have connections in Ottawa. They're just trying to make a living. And they're about to get crushed in the middle of a political pissing contest. Let's talk about what happens to specific industries if this goes south. The auto industry is probably the most vulnerable. North American auto manufacturing is completely integrated across borders. A single car might have parts that cross between the US, Canada, and Mexico 6 or 7 times before final assembly. You start imposing tariffs at each crossing, the entire system breaks down. Ford, GM, Stellantis, they've all built their supply chains around NAFTA and then CUSMA. They've invested billions in plants on both sides of the border. If that agreement falls apart, those investments become worthless. And it's not just the big manufacturers. It's the thousands of suppliers, the logistics companies, the dealerships. The entire ecosystem collapses. The energy sector is another huge problem. The US imports about 4 million barrels of Canadian oil per day. Refineries in the Midwest are specifically designed to process Canadian heavy crude. You can't just swap in a different type of oil without massive infrastructure changes. If Canadian oil gets hit with tariffs or export restrictions, those refineries either shut down or operate at reduced capacity. Either way, gas prices spike and thousands of workers lose their jobs. And here's something that's not getting enough attention: water. The Great Lakes contain about 20% of the world's fresh surface water. They're shared between the US and Canada, and they're managed through binational agreements that have been in place for over a century. If the broader relationship breaks down, what happens to those agreements? Do we start fighting over water rights? Do we see restrictions on shipping through the Great Lakes? This might sound like a distant concern, but in a world facing increasing water scarcity, control over the Great Lakes is a massive strategic asset. And then there's agriculture. Canadian farmers export billions in canola, beef, and pork to the United States. American farmers export billions in corn, soybeans, and wheat to Canada. The supply chains are completely intertwined. A trade war doesn't just hurt one side, it hurts both. And when you hurt farmers, you create political pressure that forces governments to respond. We could see a spiral where each side keeps escalating, trying to inflict maximum pain, until the economic damage is so severe that neither side can back down without major political consequences. So where does this actually end? There are really only 3 possible outcomes. Outcome 1, Canada caves. They accept some version of Trump's demands, agree to renegotiate trade terms, and essentially acknowledge that the US has economic dominance over the relationship. This is what Trump's betting on. He thinks Canada needs the US more than the US needs Canada, and eventually they'll have no choice but to fold. The problem? Canada has elections too, and no Canadian politician can survive if they're seen as surrendering to American bullying. The public backlash would be massive. Outcome 2. Trump backs down. He realizes the economic damage is too severe, declares some kind of face-saving partial victory, and quietly drops the ultimatum. This is what Canada's hoping for. They're betting that once American industries start feeling the pain, the political pressure on Trump will become unbearable. The problem? Trump doesn't back down, ever. It's not in his nature. He doubles down, triples down, and blames someone else when things go wrong. Outcome 3. Permanent fracture. Neither side blinks. The trade war escalates. The economic relationship fundamentally changes, and the US-Canada alliance as we've known it for the past 80 years ends. This is the nightmare scenario, and it's more possible than most people think, because once you cross certain lines, once you inflict certain kinds of damage, the relationship can't be repaired. The trust is gone, and without trust, you can't have a functional alliance. So where does this leave you? If you're watching this, you're already ahead of most people. You're seeing the warning signs. Keep an eye on the next 90 days. Watch what Canada does. Watch what Trump does. And most importantly, watch what they're not saying in public. Because the biggest moves in history, they don't happen on camera. Pay attention to which industries start lobbying hardest against this. Pay attention to which states are most vulnerable. Pay attention to whether other countries start picking sides. This isn't just an economic story. It's a geopolitical earthquake that's about to reshape North America. And once it starts, there's no putting the pieces back together. If you want to stay ahead of what's coming next, keep watching these developments closely. Otherwise, just keep your eyes open. This isn't over. It's just beginning.